So, YouTubers and people who follow me, welcome back. This time I'm trying a somewhat different approach to the flat earth discussion, especially because we often encounter people who from a religious background think that the earth must be flat because somehow they think it is what the Bible says. What I'm going to do here is not my atheistic approach. No, let's take the approach of that there might be something true in religion, and that means Christianity, Judaism, Muslims, any belief, any religion that is based on the Old Testament or the Bible. So you would say, what does a meter, a unit of measurement, have to do with it? And actually I'm going to show to you that it's probably the most divine unit that exists. So what is a meter? Well, it is the unit used to define a distance. It's also one of the best units to measure stuff with. It's unlike a foot, which is approximately the length of a foot, or an inch, which is approximately the width of a thumb, therefore in my own country called a dime, which is a thumb in Dutch. And it's clearly not a very reliable way which ones are clearly not very reliable ways of measurement. So the meter is the base unit of length in the international system of units. And that means that since we have that, even an inch is defined in centimeters, and a foot and a mile are also defined in parts of meters or number of meters. And not the other way around, because you have an English inch, you have a Scottish inch, you have the Dutch thumb. They're all different and therefore cannot be used as a real reference. But the meter is basically the boss under amongst the units, and I'll show you why it is the boss. So if we look at a flat Earth and the equator, and basically this is the same on the Gleason's map. This picture is just, I think, a little bit more beautiful, but. So what we have here is the position of the equator, which is at a equal distance around the North Pole. And we all know, and you can look it up everywhere, and basically there is no discrepancy between flat earthers and globers about what the length of the equator is. That's 40,000 kilometers, plus or minus a few. But in general, you could say it's 40,000 kilometers, and it is, as I said, flat earthers believe it as well, because they are happy to take the size and the speed at which within one day the globe would turn around, being 1,000 miles per hour, and well, that is impossible. But the core of it is that 1,000 miles per hour is 1,600 kilometers per hour, and times 24 brings us almost in the direction of the 40,000 kilometers. You know, what we found to be the length of the equator. And it doesn't matter if you follow it this way, like here, or on a globe. There is another way, of course, and there are many more ways of defining what the length of the equator is. For instance, if you look at the equator here, where it crosses South America, then at noon, then we take the solar time noon, that is when there is no shade, during the equinox, when the sun is moving on a flat earth exactly over the equator, then at this point here, it is, let's say, noon in Macapá in Brazil. And then it crosses over to here, and almost exactly 2 hours later, it will cross the land and then go into the sea, which is at the west coast of Ecuador, near Puerto Viejo. And that distance is about 3,300 meters, plus or minus 50, depends how accurate you can measure. And if the sun travels 3,300 kilometers in 2 hours, then in 24 hours, it does 39,600, or let's say 40,000 kilometers again. The same happens if you take the Gleason map. Here we have the point where it enters over Brazil, the sun over the equator, and then at that point it leaves the country, Ecuador. And if you see this distance from here to there, from there to there is basically the same, and these two blue lines are typical hour lines on the Gleason's map. Now, the Gleason's map has 24 of these lines, representing the 24 hours in which the sun makes a full circle. And in this case, you can clearly see that it is 2 hours, which stands between those two arrows on the Gleason's map. And now all you have to do is simply measure or search for the distance between the place Macapá in Brazil and to the coast near Puerto Viejo. And if you have that distance and you know the sun takes 2 hours, you will find that when you then calculate it for the full circle, we will end up with 40,000 kilometers. So, flat Earth or not, the equator has a length of 40,000 kilometers. Now the question is, that is 40,000 kilometers or 40 million meters, and the question is, does that meter interfere with God's creation? And as I said in the beginning, let's put all atheist arguments aside for a moment. So how does then a meter fit in with God's creation of a flat Earth, or even a globe Earth? Well, we need therefore to investigate the definition of the meter. Where does it come from? Now, under the rule of Napoleon, the meter was originally defined in 1793 as 1/10,000,000th of the distance from the equator to the North Pole. And that is interesting, because what it says is that when you take the distance from the North Pole to the equator and you divide it by 10 million, you have exactly a meter. And if this is the creation, if the flat Earth is created by a deity like the God of the Bible, then the meter is 1/10,000,000th of the distance of the created North Pole to the created equator. So it is the Earth itself that is the basis of the size of the meter. So it's not the meter was defined and then it happened to be, well, exactly 10,000 times the distance from the North Pole to the equator. No, no. It is the Earth itself that is the basis. And 10 millionth of that distance has been defined as the meter. Therefore, the meter is as strong as the creation. You can basically say that it's the creation that is the basis of the meter. Interesting is that from the equator to the outer rim is also, if you check it, 10,000 meters. So that makes the whole diameter of a possible flat Earth 40,000 kilometers. What is now so nice about the meter? Because we found the meter as being 10 millionth of a part of God's creation. And now if we take the meter and we take a cube of it, 1 meter by 1 meter by 1 meter, and we fill it with water, then we have 1,000 liters which weigh 1,000 kilos. Ain't that beautiful? There must be some hand of God in this, don't you think so? How else could it all be this beautiful and fit? So now we established that the basis of the size of the Earth, so is based on creation, and then the meter is defined on that. And we cannot fool around with the North Pole. You know, there's only one place where you can put the North Pole on the world. And it is the point in the middle of the circle which we call the equator. Now we can also not fool with the equator, because this is the line along which the sun moves twice a year, called the equinox. And where on that line, for all points on it, exact at noon, real solar time, the sun will be exactly overhead, and there is no shade cast. And because that point on the equator can be checked, you can basically walk under the sun in a way that you have to walk fast, 1,000 miles per hour, but you can walk in a way, or drive or fly in a way that the sun will be constantly exactly above you. And in that way you will make a full circle. And that full circle being the equator, which is verifiable. We can verify that the sun is exactly overhead on all these points at one moment in time during that day. All these points are 10 million meters away from the North Pole. So you could basically say that as the meter is defined from that distance, then all these points I mentioned before here have some biblical truths. You can't put the North Pole somewhere else. You can't put the equator somewhere else. The sun will move exactly over the equator, and it will do it in 24 hours. That is a biblical truth. Although the people who wrote the Bible probably had not yet thought of that. So, although it is not mentioned in the Bible, I think there is another number that is at least as defined as the meter. It is the number that makes the equator which makes the equator in God's creation a perfect circle, and that number is pi. You cannot have a circle without pi. How can the sun and the moon circle the earth if there is no pi? So the mathematical constant pi is basically a truth, and also a biblical truth. And so far we have seen that based on the sun's position during the equinox and the time between two known points on that circle, we can calculate that the equator is 40,000 kilometers in length. And it's confirmed by many flat earth researchers, but also by geosurveyors. But we have also seen that the meter is based on the size of creation itself. And that making the distance of the North Pole to the equator the reference of the meter. Now, you might ask, what about the globe? Well, on the globe, it's not much different. We know on the globe, and all globers will say that the equator is 40,000 kilometers in length. And if you look at this here, from the North Pole to the equator, which goes here, the distance is also 10,000 kilometers. So, you might believe in creation of a flat earth, or you might believe in creation as some creationists do, as a globe. In both cases, the meter is defined as the distance, 10 millionth of the distance of the North Pole to the equator, globe or flat. So what does now stand in between flat earth and the globe? Why don't they match? Well, that is the other divine number. It's God's mathematical constant pi that reveals the truth. Because if the radius on a flat Earth is 10,000 kilometers and the equator, then the equator should be 10,000 times 2 times pi is 62,000 kilometers. Wow! That is not 40,000. This is off by more than 50%. And that's no wonder that on the maps created in this wrong way, Africa, South America appear wider than they are long. And it even gets worse, because by the time you reach Australia, the circumference there is like 94,000 kilometers. So I think that for flat earthers, you do have a serious problem. You simply have a serious problem. And the problem is that somebody somehow screwed you over when translating the Bible. The meter is defined by God's own creation, whether it's a globe or a flat earth. It's 1/10,000,000th of the direction of the length of the North Pole to the equator. And with that, the circumference of the equator is not 64,000 kilometers. That is what would happen if the Earth was flat, and we know it is not that length. Thank you. Think about it. The meter proves, the divine number meter proves that, based on its definition, that the Earth cannot and certainly is not flat.